session, I do want. Okay, sorry, Chiquetta. Good morning, everyone. As we begin this session this morning, I want to begin by acknowledging that the land on which we are gathered here today at UBC Okanagan is the traditional unceded territory of the Silk Okanagan Nation and their peoples. And I also want to acknowledge that some of you might be joining us from both near and far. And I also want to acknowledge the traditional owners of those lands as well, both past and present. So, as I mentioned, my name is Joan Batorf. I'm a professor in the School of Nursing here at UBC Okanagan in Kelowna. And I'm also director of the Institute for Healthy Living and Chronic Disease Prevention at our campus. It's really a pleasure to welcome you today to our 8th annual Okanagan Embrace Aging Month. And it's really wonderful to see so many people joining us. Embrace Aging is co-hosted by the Institute for Healthy Living and Chronic Disease Prevention at UBC Okanagan, but also with our partners Interior Savings and Credit Union and Interior Health. We launched this series of events 8 years ago. The time has gone by fast, but over the years we've held numerous events to help celebrate and raise awareness about positive aging. And as you've noticed in our calendar, we've organized an equally diverse set of events for this year. And really, our goal is to design and put on events that are designed for everyone, young and old, and focus on a variety of topics related to healthy aging and ways to improve quality of life for everyone. Our goal is to inspire each and every one of us to embrace positive aging. You will see there's a closed captioning box, and mine's at the bottom of my screen. You might find that helpful, and you can move it around your monitor wherever it might be convenient. Or if you find it distracting or don't need it, at the bottom of your screen there is a little button called Live Transcript that you can click on and turn off the transcript. I'd encourage you to write questions or comments in the chat box as we go along. When we've heard from all of our panelists, we'll have a chance to look at those questions and comments and have a discussion. So I want to let you know that today's event is brought to you by the Institute for Healthy Living and Chronic Disease Prevention here at UBCO. And we're really delighted to have this panel of speakers with us today on the topic of gut health. I will introduce each of our speakers in the order in which that they are going to present, and then I'm going to turn it over to them. So our first speaker will be Dr. Deanna Gibson, who is an associate professor in biology in the Irving Barber School of Arts and Science here at UBC Okanagan. And as you will see, she has a big research program in this area. So we'll be hearing from about some of her research. And I also want to introduce Miss Natasha Haskey, who is a PhD student and registered dietitian in biology, also here at the Irving Barber Faculty of Science at UBC Okanagan. And finally, I'd like to introduce Gerald deVeer, who is past president of the Okanagan chapter of the Crohn's and Colitis Canada. So thank you for joining us, to all of our speakers, and I'm going to turn it over to Deanna, Dr. Gibson.
Thank you so much, Joan, for that wonderful introduction. And Natasha, who's going to, there we go, put my presentation up. So we're here to talk about gut health and celebrate healthy aging, which is great. One of the things that I think about when I myself think about gut health is this community of microorganisms called the gut microbiome. And we've come to understand over the last decade that this is actually a major player in both health and disease, and including in healthy aging. And we've noticed over the last decade that a gut microbiota that isn't quite what we term as healthy or normal in quotation marks has been associated with a variety of diseases, And you can see in this tree all of the diseases that it's been an unhealthy microbiome has been associated with. And that includes things that happen as we age, like diabetes and insulin resistance. We tend to have more inflammation as we age, so also systemic inflammation, cardiovascular diseases, and of course, gut-related diseases too, like inflammatory bowel disease, Crohn's disease, ulcerative colitis. My lab does focus on this area. We like to focus on all of these microorganisms and really how they stimulate immunity and what that means for various disease conditions like IBD. This is my research team right here at the bottom. And they all work on individual projects, including Natasha, who you're going to hear from today, who focuses on diet and IBD. The idea with this gut microbiome and this community of microorganisms, which is mostly bacteria, but also has some fungi, as well as some protists, and lots of viruses that we don't really quite understand yet, is that there's this balance between good and bad in really simplistic terms. But even in popular articles like Scientific America, we've come to appreciate that these microorganisms are really important. Next slide, please. Thank you. So one of my graduate students who's doing her PhD, Jacqueline, made me this beautiful slide for today. And that is because I really wanted to describe the relationship, or at least introduce the relationship between the gut, the brain, and the liver. And that is because there's a bidirectional relationship with those systems from the gut, as well as from the brain or the liver to the gut. And when we think about the gut, we have to consider diet, because it's one of the things that we do every single day. We eat, and that really influences what goes on not only in the gut, but also in the brain and in our liver. So if we look at the very top here, this is actually a diagram of the gut. And this yellow stuff is a bunch of mucus that we have on the layer of our gut, and our food interacts at that layer. So if we have complex carbohydrates, right, our gut microorganisms that are sort of within that layer can actually metabolize things that we don't. We don't digest certain carbohydrates, but the bacteria can. And then the bacteria releases really important molecules that influence what happens immunologically. So it influences our immune system, as well as our digestive hormones. So hormones like GLP-1, for example, controls whether we feel full or not. And it signals to the rest of the body to tell us, yes, we have enough food, we can stop now. So this obviously can influence things like whether we eat more or whether we eat less. So our calorie load, which can influence obesity and diabetes. Other molecules like tryptophan they're just amino acids, but they actually play a really important role as well. And they can communicate with various bacteria, and the bacteria can utilize that to produce other metabolites that are important, like indoles, we call them indoles, which influences whether our gut produces serotonin or not. Of course, serotonin can be produced in the gut, but can also influence what happens in the brain. So all of these molecules that are influenced by our diet and then our gut microbiota and signal to our immune system have the ability to go through our circulation and then can influence the enteric nervous system, which then can communicate with the brain. And the brain does all sorts of really vital things, of course, for our health. And some of these metabolites that come from the bacteria can directly influence them and cross the blood-brain barrier. We know that. But also there are indirect methods too, through this vagus nerve. And so, for example, metabolites that influence the vagus nerve can actually signal whether we produce cortisol or not from our pituitary gland. And then the cortisol levels can actually influence the gut microbes in the gut. So for example, cortisol can influence whether we have increased bad bacteria and decreased good bacteria. So there's this bidirectional relationship. And not only serotonin, but other molecules in the gut can influence whether we have a stress response or anxiety response in the brain. And this is a really important area of research that we know very little about, but that there is indeed a relationship between our behaviors and what happens in our gut. And no doubt this is influenced by diet. Similarly, there's a relationship with the gut and the liver. And the relationship is also bidirectional. We receive signals from the gut through the portal vein, and this can influence various production of metabolites and hormones. So if we have a normal, healthy microbiota, and as we age, we tend to have more inflammation, and certainly our gut microbiota does change as we age. We might have what we call dysbiosis. And this dysbiosis is really just what we microbiomic people refer to as an altered microbiome, one that's been associated with diseases and often chronic inflammation. And there's some evidence that supports that this dysbiosis really drives various disease conditions like allergies and this dysregulated inflammation, metabolic dysfunction, and even psychiatric conditions. Next slide, please. So knowing that all of the microorganisms which are influenced by diet can change their metabolic output, and this can influence our central nervous system, depression, anxiety, behavior disorders, as well as our gastrointestinal system and our liver. The question becomes, what can we do about it? Can we normalize this dysbiosis? Can we promote what we call rebiosis? And so there's a number of things that we are thinking about as we try to solve these problems. Of course, probiotics is probably on a number of your minds. Can probiotics influence this? Can prebiotics influence this? There's a whole field dedicated to understanding the role of live biotherapeutics. And this might include things like genetically modified or next generation probiotics or consortiums of bacteria. So that means more than two, a community, but a defined community. People do think about fecal transplants. That tends to get a popular news, but it's not necessarily safe to use fecal transplants because we don't necessarily know what microorganisms are doing what yet, and the donors aren't necessarily defined. So that can be really challenging, although there is good evidence that fecal transplants do work in the context of C. diff. Or we might be thinking about isolating microbial derived products. And I just have something in the chat here. What's another word for dysbiosis? Another word for dysbiosis is just a microbiome that's associated with disease. So it's a diseased microbiome. So as we think about how we can normalize or promote this rebiosis or a normal microbiome, we don't quite know how to yet, but I'm happy to discuss it during our panel chat. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to my PhD student who will cover diet and the microbiome and gut health. Thank you, Natasha.
Okay, so thank you so much, Deanna, for providing the background to what I'm going to talk about today. So my focus today really is moving into, okay, so now we know that diet alters the microbes and the metabolites, which alters immunity and our metabolism, which leads to chronic disease. But what can we actually do about this? So we do get a lot of questions as professionals studying this area around diet, because it is very popular, and we do know that diet influences the microbiome. And what's challenging right now is that this is a relatively new field, a new field of study, and we still don't have all the answers. But in the process of reading many, many papers and consulting with many professionals throughout the world, there are a few suggestions that we can provide individuals when it does come to diet. And so what I'm trying to discuss today is the evidence-based recommendations, because there's lots of misinformation out there. There's lots of books you can purchase. Just even Googling diet and the microbiome. There's so much information. It's even challenging as a scientist to figure out what is correct and what's incorrect, because everyone feels like they have the answer. So one of the things I want to say today is that one of the things we can do to change our microbiota or influence the microbiome is increasing our intake of fiber. Now, I know this sounds like a very simple recommendation, but unfortunately, the majority of Canadians aren't even meeting the suggested recommendations for fiber, which would be 38 grams for men and 25 grams for women. So there's studies looking at the intakes of Canadians suggest that we're only eating half the amount of fiber that we require. And the rationale for increasing the fiber in our diet is that if we don't feed these microbes that are living in our digestive tract, they actually begin to feed on us. So Deanna had mentioned the importance of this mucus barrier in our digestive tract. And this mucus barrier has a protective effect. So what we found through studies is that diets that are deficient in fiber, we see a thinner than normal mucus layer, and this could be changed through different fiber sources. So some simple things we can do to increase fiber in our diet, and I'm sure you've heard a number of these, but I will also mention them again because it is so important. So the importance of switching to whole grain rice, pasta, breads, and cereals, switching to high fiber breakfast cereals, increasing fruit and vegetable intake. And so through a number of studies, we've seen that the fiber that comes from fruit and vegetable intake is very important to feeding these good microbes, just because of the different fiber sources. And I'm sure you've heard about antioxidants. All of these feed the so-called health-associated good bacteria in our gut. So a simple way to increase fruit and vegetable intake is through smoothies. Another thing you can do is add different nuts and seeds to your diet. So some very simple tips you can do to enhance your gut health. The other thing is the importance of label reading. So I just threw this slide up here just because sometimes the nutrition facts label on products can be confusing, but we are looking for foods that have high fiber, which means that there's 4 grams of fiber per serving, or a very high fiber source would be 6 grams. And so a simple way to get 7 grams of fiber right off the bat in your day would be to have half a cup of cooked oatmeal with half a chopped apple and putting some almonds on top of that. And that's an easy way to start your day with fiber and also feed your microbes. Another thing that's very interesting, there's a lot of discussion around probiotics. Probiotics are the actual bacteria themselves, but prebiotics are actually a type of fiber as well. And with these prebiotics, what they do is that they specifically only feed the good microbes in your gut. So we're also finding that Canadians or North Americans do not get enough prebiotics in their diet. So by increasing these types of foods, we can feed those good bacteria. And the other thing that happens is that when the bacteria feed on these prebiotics, they produce different types of metabolites. And Deanna kind of alluded to that. And so these different types of metabolites, one of them is called short chain fatty acids, actually feed our colon cells. So we need these energy sources to keep our colon cells healthy. Another thing that's kind of on the horizon is the discussion around resistant starch. So what's interesting is that resistant starch is a little bit different than some of the other carbohydrates in your diet, in that they're different in that we as humans do not have the enzymes to actually break down resistant starch. So they actually travel through our digestive tract. and reach the colon and are fermented by our good bacteria. So again, recent studies have looked at the intake of resistant starch in Canadians and in the US, and they suggest that we're only consuming about 5 grams per day. And whereas our target intake should actually be 5 grams per meal. So an easy way to get more resistant starch in your diet is through different fiber sources. And so on the right-hand side of your slide, you'll see some different ways you can get that resistant starch in your diet. And I do want to highlight the legumes like beans, peas, lentils, something that as Canadians, again, we're consuming very, very little. In fact, they say that we ship most of our legumes out to other countries and don't consume them ourselves. However, the type of fiber found in these legumes is very important to gut health. I also want to mention protein. There have been some studies suggesting the type of proteins we consume can influence the microbes living in our gut. So the bottom line is that more plant protein sources are beneficial for different bacteria versus proteins coming from animal sources, in particular red meat. So high consumption of red meat, unfortunately, has been associated with some of those bacteria that can cause, I would say, disease. And so I'm not saying that red meat is terrible, but as Canadians, we're actually consuming too much. And so the recommendation is that we actually reduce the amount of red meat we're consuming to approximately once per week maximum, and increase more of the plant-based sources of proteins like legumes, soy, and things like that. So the last point I want to make is, and it's where my research actually comes in, and Deanna's done extensive research on this as well, is looking at the type of fat we consume and how it actually might influence inflammation and gut health. And we're actually seeing that it does in fact have an influence on overall gut health. So there are different, just as a reminder, there's different types of fats we actually do consume in our diet. One being saturated fat that would come from dairy fat, coconut oil, as well as processed and red meats. The monounsaturated fats, which are generally found in olive oil and avocados, the omega-6, which could be in corn oil, safflower, and sunflower, and then the omega-3, which are often found in the fattier fish and things like flaxseed. So overall, what we have found is that different types of fat affect inflammation differently. So to sum up, what I want to discuss is just to give you some tips. I want you to think from now on, like change the way you think about fats, because certainly even throughout my dietetic career, we've certainly thought of fats as being bad, and then the food industry followed with this thinking, and you know, we've sort of shifted into this world where we shouldn't be eating fat and, you know, choose low-fat products, whereas we actually have a different mindset and have seen from our research studies that we actually do need to include fat in our diet, but we need to pay attention to the type of fat we're consuming. So what we would recommend, and others are following, is that we need to reduce those omega-6 fatty acids in our diet, those from corn oil, soybean, safflower oil, and replace them with things like olive oil, nuts, nut butters, and different types of nuts and seeds. Now, a lot of people tell me, well, I don't use soybean oil, I don't use corn oil, but if you eat anything that's packaged and processed, generally you will see that they do contain, unfortunately, soybean and some of these omega-6 fatty acids. The other thing that you can do is increase your intake of omega-3, because we have seen that omega-3 in the right context is beneficial for inflammation as well as gut health, but not from supplements. We encourage people to eat more fish and seafood, in particular those foods that are rich in the more fattier fish. So tuna, mackerel, salmon tend to have more of the omega-3 fatty acids in them. Also change the way you think about red meat. So instead of planning your meals around the protein source such as chicken or red meat, think about trying a vegetarian dish once a week. Also including dairy products. Certainly the fermented dairy products have been, we think it's the type of fat that can be beneficial, and it doesn't need to be low fat. Vegetables, again, I can't say enough. We need to increase our intake of vegetables, fruits, because simply they do have the fiber sources we need to maintain a healthy gut. And then I had mentioned before the whole grains. So if I were to put this together into a beautiful picture, we have the Mediterranean diet that incorporates all these different concepts. And I encourage you to check out some different resources by Old Ways, it's called, and the website is at the bottom of the page. And maybe that could be put into the chat box for individuals. But there's some amazing resources on this website that if you choose do want to make a change to your diet, I would encourage you to go this way and avoid those fad diets. And lastly, if I may, as part of my PhD project, I am still recruiting patients that have colitis, that are over 18. And if you're interested in participating in a research diet study, please send me an email. And with that, I will pass things over to Gerald.
Thank you, Natasha, and thank you, Deanna, for things that you guys spoke on there. I've lived with IBD for most of my life. I was diagnosed with ulcerative colitis at 9 years of age. Well, 15 years ago, the diagnosis was changed to Crohn's disease. So living with that, I've kind of been a lifelong experiment with dietitians, doctors, naturopaths, all suggesting different things to eat, different medications, and so on. So my disease was manageable until I was in my 20s. And then from there, it was about 10 years of regular weekly doctor visits, appointments, specialists, hospital visits, hospital stays, prolonged hospital stays. And when I started out, I was taking medications like Asacol, azathioprine, prednisone, antibiotics, probiotics, and all those sort of things. Eventually, my body started metabolizing them so fast and digesting them, I wasn't getting any nutrients out of them. So they were just being excreted through my body, and I wasn't getting any sort of medications. So my doctor switched me over to intravenous medications. Started out with methotrexate, Humira, Remicade, Entyvio, Stelara. Again, with those, my body over time started metabolizing them faster than I could digest them and they could be any help. So that's when I made the decision, with my doctor's advice and support, to have my colon removed. Majority of my Crohn's disease at that time was contained to my large intestine. So the decision there was to just have that taken out and live with an ileostomy. Since then, the last 4 years, I've been healthy and strong and haven't really looked back, and it's been kind of the best case scenario for me. Living with IBD for most of my life hasn't just been a physical illness, it's been a mental illness. There is direct relation there between the gut and the brain. It's like you look at it and, does anyone really know what other people are feeling inside? Like, can you share how you're feeling? It's not really something that you can express, and it's, if you could see something, you can see a cut on somebody, but you can't share that and express that with other people. So when I was about 14 years old, when my doctors told me that my chances of having colon cancer by the time I was 40 was about 100 times greater than the normal healthy person. So that's, again, something that mental carry on somebody that's dealing with other illnesses and that sort. So living with that growing up, my response to everybody, like it was hard to share how you're feeling. So everybody would ask me all the time, how are you doing? And it would be, I'm good, I'm fine, kind of the generic response. But it wasn't really until 4 years ago when I had my operations, my surgery, that I could truly tell people that I felt good and I felt great. It was a relief on myself, my family, mentally, and just able to live life with an ostomy is one thing, and it's something that you still have to deal with, but to live life with not having to take 10, 20 pills a day, be taking injections weekly, it's just it was a relief for me. And just to not have to always worry about where the next bathroom stop is and know where every bathroom is between here and the grocery store if we can't make it anywhere. Living with Crohn's disease, that's kind of the one thing you look out for, is you need bathrooms essentially on call. So now that I've been able to overcome those hurdles, and I really want to help out and reach out to people that are suffering from it and that need that support. For me, when I was sick, when I was dealing with the illnesses, I couldn't bring myself to go to those groups, to reach out to those people, and I wish I would have. So I want to be there for those people that need that support, that need, hey, try this, try that, but it's an experiment, right? So I want to be part of that solution for other people and work with teams like Natasha and Deanna to come up with hopefully a better way of life for people that have to deal with IBD. So that's what I've got. And we'll open it up now, I think, Joan.
Yes, great. Thank you very much for sharing your story, Gerald, and for your great dietary advice, Natasha, and for sharing some of the biology behind what we need to understand about gut health, Dr. Gibson. This has been really great to get these three different perspectives. And so at this point, I'd like to encourage people to put comments and questions in the chat box. And I see we already have some, and some of them have been quickly answered by, I think, Dr. Gibson as we went along. But if you think that you need more information, just put your comments in the chat box or your questions. And maybe we could begin with some of the questions. And this is, I don't know if you have ideas about this, you, Gerald or Natasha, and you both might have some ideas for getting fiber on a low residue diet due to severe Crohn's. Any tips?
Do you want to start, Gerald? Like, it's always nice to hear from an individual, right?
For myself, when I had a colon, when I was dealing with Crohn's disease and everything else, fiber didn't really affect me, and I found I could eat as much fiber as possible. So I found I would, my diets were very adaptive. Dealing with Crohn's disease, since I've had an ileostomy, fiber has been one challenging food to eat, because the fiber is mostly digested in your large intestine, I believe. So with it coming out of an ileostomy, it takes a lot of fluids to kind of help digest it. So I've kind of had to stay away from fiber, or really monitor and limit my intake with an ileostomy. So
right. As a couple things that I might suggest is, first of all, things like smoothies. If you get a really, really good blender, it can help break down some of those fiber sources. I've heard from patients that that can be helpful, and you can hide a lot of things, different types of fibers in smoothies and make them taste good. Another option is hiding fruits and vegetables in soups, softening the fruits and vegetables, say vegetables even par cooked in the microwave. Can help as well. I noticed a question about nuts being intolerant. Certainly you get the same benefits if you use a smooth nut butter. And certainly there's different, it's not just peanut butter, you can use almond butter, cashew butter, all those different things to get some additional fat, protein, as well as sometimes calories if need be.
Yeah, I'd follow up on that too, just with the whole smoothie diet. I lived for probably 2 years just on smoothies, like everything was blended or pureed or soup. And it's even the seeds that you don't really think about, like strawberry seeds, the tiny little ones that get stuck in your gut that can cause irritation and that sort of stuff. So I think it's really looking into the things you are putting in and trying to do not process, but like cooked down fruits and vegetables, and pureeing out any of those seeds or nuts and that sort of stuff. So that's where nut butters work good.
Great advice. Thank you both for that. That's great. There was just to let people know, we are recording this session, so it'll be available to you afterwards for those of you who are wondering. There's a question from Pam. Natasha, could you tell us a little bit more about your research? So not quite sure exactly what people would like to know about your research, but maybe you could just briefly tell us the research question you're trying to answer, maybe, and maybe something like that.
Oh, sure. Yeah, I'll just do really high level. So I joined Dr. Gibson's lab as a dietitian. Interestingly enough, we had very similar interests in we both are very interested in inflammation and inflammatory bowel disease, and working towards finding a particular diet that may work for individuals that have inflammatory bowel disease, because surprisingly the research is actually very poor in this particular area. So because Dr. Gibson was looking at different types of fat, and through some of her animal models of colitis found differences in inflammation depending on the type of fat that is fed, we decided that wouldn't it be interesting to look at how a blend of fats actually might influence inflammation. So what I've been doing for my PhD is looking at in an animal model what happens when we give a blend of fats, that blend of fats being like what we provide in a Mediterranean diet. And then I'm also running a human study looking at what happens, can individuals that have ulcerative colitis in particular, number one, tolerate a diet, a Mediterranean diet, because as we're hearing here that sometimes fibers can be difficult to tolerate. And surprisingly, as dietitians, we actually recommend to cut out all fiber sources. And I'm actually not sure that's the correct recommendation now that all of the information is coming out on the microbiome. So what we're looking at is, can we influence some of the inflammatory markers, symptoms, and disease activity in individuals that have colitis using a Mediterranean diet. And actually, as we've worked through our project, we've connected with others in Canada that are doing similar type of research. Some are looking a little bit closer at the protein content of the diet and what that's would be beneficial, different carbohydrates, that kind of thing. So hopefully we can continue on the path to find something that might work for individuals with inflammatory bowel disease. But it may apply to others as well. We'll see.
Great. We look forward to your results, and maybe we'll have to have you back to share those at some point. And I know there are people joining us from outside Kelowna, and can people from outside Kelowna join your study if they want to, or is it more for our region?
No, it
Okay.
can be anywhere. Actually, we take anybody.
All right. Okay. There's an invite to everyone who's on the line who that might be applicable to. Dr. Gibson, I think this is a great question. Can you prevent getting IBD through diet? So can we prevent some of these diseases that are linked to the microbiome through our diet? Get ahead of the game.
Yeah, that's a really, really important question, and one that obviously we're really interested in. Our human studies can't target that, so we do use rodents to sort of understand this, and we do look at really early life points. And we even look at things like maternal diet, and we have a number of studies that have shown that maternal diet, so diet taken by mom and how it influences mom's microbiome, can influence their offspring. And even though their offspring may not have seen that diet, they carry the microorganisms from mom, from the maternal transfer. And this can influence things like colitis susceptibility later on in their life. So can we prevent with diet? We might have to start with previous generations. So maybe grandmom and mom. And so we always get to blame everything on mom. And now that I'm a mom, I feel that pain deeply. But of course, there are certain things that we don't understand. So of course, it's not mom's fault. Moms are usually taking recommendations. But as we learn more about diet and we study different types of fats in the diet, as well as pesticides on diet, this can actually influence whether we prevent colitis or not. And so these are the studies that we do in our lab, some of which are published, some of which are not. It's hard to give very specific advice because, you know, some of them are still not published studies, but some of our published studies indicate that the type of fat that we eat can actually influence. Maybe a lot of you don't want to hear this, but the studies that we showed were an inordinate amount of omega-3s. So we're talking like probably you take, you know, several supplement pills per day, right? So this is a supraphysiological dose of omega-3s can actually, so if mom is taking massive amounts of omega-3s, this can actually influence whether her offspring has pathobiomes or bacteria that are bad, and this can influence immunity. And later in that offspring's life, they are more susceptible to colitis. So things like that. Again, one of the major reasons why we do not recommend supplementing with fish oil, but instead eating fish to just get more physiologically relevant and omega-3s. So we do know that the answer is yes, but giving specific recommendations, it's still really too preliminary for me to say.
And is the relationship between maternal diet and children's future health, is it through pregnancy and through transfer through the placenta, or is it through breastfeeding? How do the two interact? Do we know?
Yeah, so most of our studies are done during gestation, and some of them have separated out lactation and gestation, but some of them just go through that entire perinatal period. So I can't answer specifically because it could either be through gestation or through lactation. I think both those periods of time are really, really important, especially if mom is breastfeeding, right? So certainly while baby's gestating, but the research is really unclear about the placental transfer. So there's sort of camps of research that support that this is happening and camps of research that support that that's not happening. So I would say we just don't know yet.
Yeah. So it sounds like there's not a good time to start changing your diet. Today is the best time. This next question is a great question, and it's for you, Gerald. I'm a social worker in healthcare, and I have a question for Gerald. Are there any types of support or interventions you could recommend I can provide to my patients with a type of debilitating chronic illness like you described? So in an ideal world, what do you think might work best?
the best group that I found that I like support in was the Crohn's and Colitis Foundation. So it's a Canadian-wide foundation. There's local chapters everywhere throughout BC and Canada. Right now, everybody meets on Zoom, which is pretty easy to get into, and you could sit there silently and not say anything, but it's been a great network to reach out to people, to share your story, and or just to hear other stories and get that peer support of that there's everybody out there, that from kids to adults to seniors that are dealing with it. There's somebody there that you can reach out to. So that was my biggest group, or just even online groups. There's support groups and you can just meet via text, and you don't have to put a face to your name. So.
And are there, groups for the young, preteen, teenagers and adults? Are they separate, or are they all together?
They're all together. That is one thing I've trying to be an advocate for Crohn's and colitis, is to try and get some younger groups for teenagers that don't want to sit in a room with their parents, friends, or that sort of stuff. But it is something that there is a hole there that needs to be filled, I feel. And there is an opportunity to get these groups together for young people to not live alone.
Yeah, great suggestion. Maybe we could get some of our students working on that. There's a question about prednisone, and can you speak to how prednisone impacts all of this, and whether that can be systemic or localized prednisone? I'm not sure who wants to talk to that. Dr. Gibson?
Well, that is a drug that reduces inflammation. So certainly some drugs, steroids will not just reduce the inflammation in the gut, but will also reduce systemic inflammation. And so this is good if you have a chronic inflammatory disease where inflammation is really your foe and no longer your friend. Now, does it influence the gut microbiome? Yeah, there's some research to suggest that some of these drugs do influence the gut microbiome. Now, whether that's good or whether that's bad, it's really hard to know. We're sort of at a stage in microbiome research where, I talked about whether things are good or whether they're bad, but that is really oversimplistic, because they are a community. All the microorganisms in the microbiome, they are a community. We can think about them as individual microbes, but it's not right, because they are kind of like an organ system of their own, and they talk to each other, and they talk to our gut. And so whether we single out one microorganism as being good or bad, it is very oversimplistic. And that brings us to, do probiotics work, because they're individual microbes. And in some cases, some individual microbes can influence the entire system overall to be good, if you will. But whether drugs influence the gut microbiota, it's kind of, I don't want to say that it's irrelevant, but maybe less important than the fact that that drug is controlling your inflammation, which is required if you have that disease. So that's really important, right? Is controlling that damaging inflammation.
Mm-hmm.
I was on prednisone for many years, off and on, obviously, because you can't stay on it. It worked great to settle down my Crohn's disease, but later on, I found that there was more side effects that it was worth taking. At the end, I admitted myself into the hospital instead of going on prednisone, because I was like, it's not worth it. And it's still paying consequences of extended use of prednisone, of bone density. And one of the worst things was the mental depression that the prednisone put me in. So everybody has different reactions, but for me, I couldn't take it anymore. Even though it worked, like it would settle down my Crohn's disease in days, but it just wasn't worth it.
Yeah.
And I think that's a really, really a good point, is that all of the drugs that we have for controlling IBD, the point is really to reduce the inflammation and get you into a state of remission, but you can't stay on them long term. The negative side effects are catastrophic for one's life. which is why we continue to work on this and try new solutions, because the solutions that are available are really not good ones.
Yeah. So Natasha, this is a related question that might be good for you. I'm in acute inflammation, which is what we're talking about right at the moment. Are smoothies with spinach and raw fruit safe, or should they be cooked? So it's like, what food can you eat when you're in acute inflammation?
So it really is going to be dependent on the individual situation, but generally, like I say, if you are able to add some of these vegetables and fruits into a blender, and a really good quality blender will pulverize them down. And like Gerald had mentioned, you know, every individual is different. So he found some foods bothered him, some didn't, and I hear that from others. So I think the key is, I know we're talking fiber today and that we want to get more fiber into our diet, but please don't go out and all of a sudden try and get 38 grams of fiber tomorrow, because you're going to feel the side effects. So the key thing is gradually adding fiber into your diet. So trying a handful of spinach tomorrow in your smoothie, see how you do. Generally, it takes 24 to 48 hours for some people to get symptoms. So, and then if you're okay with that, then maybe try a little bit more or add in another type of fruit or vegetable, just so you know what is causing the symptoms.
That's great advice. There are the fiber supplements, and there's a question about that. For example, Metamucil, and wondering if they are useful for gut microbiome, or is more natural food better? But do the things like fiber supplements have a place at all?
Yeah, so I mean, what I would suggest is always food first, because it's always a more physiologically relevant dose. And what I learned being involved in the research area is sometimes things that we thought were very, very benign and aren't going to cause any issues can actually, depending on the circumstances, can actually create more problems. So it really depends on the situation. You know, if you're severely constipated and you know you've tried everything, perhaps something like a psyllium, which is Metamucil, will actually help if you just have tried everything else. And there are different types of prebiotic supplements in the marketplace as well. But again, we don't always know how that's going to affect the gut. So again, there's just so much research that still needs to be pursued because it can, in some cases, depending on the bacteria that are there, cause more inflammation. So we really have to be cautious and not over supplement either.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you. So this question, to supplement diet, is there a list of probiotic supplements that are useful for different conditions? So this kind of goes on to that. And I don't know if you want to speak to that, Dr. Gibson. Do we?
Yeah. So for IBD, probiotics are not clinically recommended because they are not clinically efficacious. For other conditions like IBS, there's some clinical data to support that some probiotics do have a beneficial effect. So I think that the idea that probiotics work, it's a good one. It's a really good one. And I think there's a lot of hope and promise, but we have to start to understand that there aren't just, the 7 probiotics that are currently commercially available that work for every disease and every condition. We as scientists have to find the new probiotics, sort of the next generation probiotics, perhaps enhance their efficacy, and then study them for individual diseases. Because the idea that a complex microorganism can influence your gut health, I mean, it's a good idea. And there's a lot of evidence to support that potentially can work. But we have to study them sort of in the context of each disease condition, which we're starting to do. And then also perhaps, you know, one of the things that I like to think about is, well, can those beneficial bacteria colonize and persist in an unhealthy gut because there's so much inflammation? And so we as scientists have to start to think about solutions of how we can actually get those probiotics to stick and find their niche and then influence gut health. So there isn't a list, unfortunately, that I could give you to say, yes, this is going to work for X, Y, and Z, but I can tell you it's a very intense area of research. And I think within the next decade, certainly we're going to see solutions coming out in that area. But right now, my personal opinion about most of the commercially available probiotics, given that it is sort of an unregulated area as well, is that it probably is just a waste of money right now. But I think that we need to just think about the fact that solutions most certainly will be found within that area in time.
Great, thank you. We'll have to stay tuned, obviously, to the emerging research.
Now, in saying that, I still eat my yogurt every single day, and I still, you know, yeah.
I'm glad to hear that. I do too. Because someone asked about, you know, what foods might give you those probiotics, and so there was a few questions on food. You know, what foods are natural, give you natural probiotics, I guess. What about fermented foods? What about sugar? Are there some foods to avoid for lower inflammation? So they're all questions around different aspects of how do we select the food we eat. I don't know, Natasha, do you want to try and answer some of those questions?
Well, the fermented foods question is quite a popular one. And to be honest, probiotics, well, it's a bit confusing because there are a lot of the commercially available products, they have added a probiotic into the food, but there hasn't been a lot of research generally in the population, and we don't know if those bacteria stick or not. But what I can say about fermented foods, probiotics aside, is that there are other compounds in fermented foods that are beneficial to health. So the sauerkraut, the kefir, yogurt, those types of things. So in light of the other benefits of fermented foods, it's probably something that we can include in our diet. Not only for the microbial effects that we really don't have a good handle on right now.
Great, thank you. My goodness, there's a whole bunch of questions here. I'm not sure we're going to get to them all today. Okay, here's a question about, in reading about the microbiome, it appears that important microbiota through the digestive system, but the majority of the benefit from a healthy gut is about microbiome in the large intestine. My family member has had his colon removed and has a J pouch, so there's special things related to the microbiome when one doesn't have a colon. Gerald, I don't know, you kind of hinted at that you had to change some of your diet, or at least be more careful about your diet.
Yeah, so I had to monitor. I just did write a bit of a comment there in the chat box about this, but just monitor the grainy foods and high fiber foods with not having the colon, and making sure drinking lots of fluids to stay hydrated were kind of the triggers. I haven't really had any big issues with digestion since not having a colon. I did previously did the FODMAP diet, which was a great success initially, but once I reintroduced everything, and then it kind of rescinded, and then I tried it again and it didn't work the second time. So it's kind of I've always found it's everybody to their own to try and eliminate foods and try foods in moderation. If you're going to try cauliflower, don't have a bowl full of cauliflower, have a little piece and see what happens, and the next time have a little bit more. But yeah, just don't indulge on something too much at one time. I would say would be the best way to try things out.
That's great advice, I think, because people are pretty individual, and as our science is so new in this area, that's probably what we can count on. There's a number of other comments, but I'm not sure that we're going, and questions, but lots of positive comments about the stories and the information that you shared today. And so I'd encourage people, if you have questions, to contact our speakers. I'm sure they'd be happy to hear from you, but maybe we could close the session by just hearing briefly if you have any final advice or information that you think you might want to share as a kind of a closing comment. And maybe we'll start with you, Dr. Gibson. Any closing comments for our audience?
Yeah, I think one of the big messages that should be stated is that we actually each have our own microbiome. Okay, and this is probably one of the reasons why there's such vast, variation between what people experience too. And so it's important to note it's not all in your head. You have to listen to your body. And I think as the science progresses, we're going to start to understand that we need individual diets based on our individual microbiome, which we may or may not share with our friends and our neighbors. And so personalized medicine and what we call precision medicine in the context of nutrition, I think you'll see is going to be a very big thing in the very near future, but we're just not there yet. But we are working very hard to understand why this variation in diet happens. But it's important that you listen to your body and for now, test and try different things and then see if it works for you or not.
Great, thanks so much. And Natasha, any final words?
I think what I would say is just be cautious with the information that is out there. A lot of it, there's some really good information, there's some not so good information, and anything that's over promising, suggesting it's going to cure your microbiome, supplements that are going to cure your microbiome, it's likely not true. We know the science isn't there yet, so look for reputable sources, different national organizations, for example, like Dietitians of Canada, or some registered dietitians that specialize in gut health. Look at some of their information. Because we're regulated, we have standards that we have to abide by. So just be cautious and don't fall into the trap of these fad diets and misinformation.
Great, thank you. And Gerald, we'll leave the last word for you.
I just close on just saying that everybody's responsible for their own health. You need to be on yourself, and you need to be on your support team to help you out. Just to go by the wayside and let the doctors do things or your support team do things without sharing with them. You need to speak up, you need to go out, and you need to be persistent to get the help you need. Yeah.
That's great. Thank you very much. There's lots of wonderful positive comments about your presentations and the conversation that we've had over the last hour. And so on behalf of everyone who joined us today and the Embrace Aging team, I want to really thank you, the three of you, for joining us today and for sharing this great information about gut health. And I also want to thank everyone who joined us today and hope that you might be able to join us for another one of our Embrace Aging sessions before the end of the month. So thanks again, and we'll stay tuned. And obviously we need to invite this team back again after we've heard after Natasha's had a chance to finish her research. So thanks again, and we'll say bye for now.